What did a Maya house really look like 2,000 years ago? Not the stone temples from travel posters, not the towering pyramids that still rise above the jungle, and not the romantic image many people carry in their minds, as if the ancient Maya lived in miniature palaces of carved stone. Most did not. The grand monuments were real, but they were not the place where most life happened. The real center of Maya civilization was the household, the low building on a platform, the swept patio, the kitchen fire, the grinding stone, the roof that had to hold through rain, heat, and years of use. If we want to understand the Maya as human beings and not as silhouettes behind ruins, then we have to leave the pyramid for a moment and step into the house. 2,000 years ago, the Maya world was already old. Families had been living in settled communities and practicing agriculture for many centuries. In the lowlands, major centers were rising, limestone was being quarried, and plaster could be made by burning limestone or shells. But for ordinary people, the house was still built less like a monument and more like a living answer to climate, labor, and family routine. This is the first thing modern eyes often miss. We tend to imagine permanence as the highest form of civilization. The ancient Maya did not always build that way at home. They built to breathe, to dry out, to be repaired, to be renewed, and to hold together the people who lived inside. And there was no single Maya house. The Maya world stretched across a huge region of what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Landscapes differed, resources differed, status differed, time periods differed. But across that wide world, certain patterns return again and again. Residential compounds arranged around patios, low platforms supporting perishable superstructures, walls of poles and daub, thatched roofs, clay or plastered floors, benches in more substantial homes, hearths, storage vessels, and the constant presence of maize in one form or another. That is why when archaeologists try to recover domestic life, they do not look for one frozen blueprint. They look for a family resemblance. And once you see that resemblance, a Maya settlement begins to change before your eyes. The first impression would not have been height. It would have been order. You would not approach a common Maya home and feel overpowered by walls. You would feel yourself entering a worked space, a cleared space, a space kept intentional by human hands. In some excavated Maya households, the patio was hard-packed from use and kept clear of trash and vegetation. That detail matters. The center of domestic life was not chaos. It was discipline made visible on the ground. The house did not stand alone like an isolated cabin. It belonged to a yard, to companion structures, to a household group whose buildings faced each other across a shared open area. Life happened between buildings as much as within them. The patio was not empty. It was the stage on which daily life moved. Then your eyes would go to the platform. Again and again in Maya archaeology, domestic buildings appear raised above the surrounding ground on low earthen or stone platforms. Sometimes the rise was modest, sometimes more substantial. But even a low platform changed the entire relationship between house and earth. It marked the dwelling as a place set apart from the yard. It created an edge, a threshold, a slight ascent into domestic space. In pre-classic communities, post holes and house platforms show that many dwellings were built with perishable upper parts that have long vanished, leaving only the prepared base, the floor, and traces of supports. The house we picture today is often only the stone memory of a much softer structure. That upper structure was rarely all stone. In fact, this is where the illusion created by ruins breaks down. The monumental center survived because stone survives. Ordinary houses often did not, because they were made from materials that were meant to live in partnership with climate and then decay. Timber posts, saplings, vines, reeds, grass, palm, mud, plaster. Excavated examples and ethnographic comparisons point again and again to houses of pole and thatch, or wattle and daub, what in some regions is called bajareke. In better-built residences, low masonry or adobe walls might rise partway before lighter materials took over above. But the silhouette most families lived under was not a stone vault. It was a thatched roof held on a wooden frame. That roof mattered more than many modern viewers realize. In a humid world of fierce sun and seasonal rains, the roof was shelter, ventilation, repair schedule, and insurance policy all at once. It had to throw off water, survive wind, and allow smoke to escape without turning the house into an oven. Ethnographic and archaeological reconstructions suggest that the walls were often not the main load-bearing element at all. The essential strength came from the posts and roof frame. So when you stood before a Maya house, what you were really seeing was not a box with a lid. You were seeing a carefully balanced frame dressed in lighter materials. The house was less like masonry and more like woven architecture. It stood because tension, weight, and habit all knew their place. And if you touched the wall, you would not necessarily feel cold stone. In many homes, you would feel dried earth, poles set close together, branches woven through them, mud pressed on both sides and left to harden. Later preserved examples from the Maya world show these Bajarek walls could be surprisingly resilient, even earthquake-resistant, because the flexible organic frame and earth coating worked together rather than fighting each other. That is not the architecture of people who did not know what they were doing. It is the architecture of people who knew their landscape intimately. They knew which materials were close at hand, which ones could be repaired, and which ones could be replaced without needing a quarry or a royal labor force. The floor beneath your feet would have told another story. Sometimes it was clay, sometimes packed earth, sometimes plaster. In some Maya households, archaeologists have found clay floors fired after drying. In others, mud plaster floors or prepared living surfaces. However it was finished, the floor was not incidental. It was the real interior plane of life. Children sat there. Food was prepared near it. Vessels rested on it. Ash fell on it. Feet crossed it dozens of times each day. In later, better preserved houses, we can even see how different surfaces were renewed or replaced as use wore them down. A house floor was not merely the bottom of a room. It was the most continuously worked surface in the household, the place where order had to be remade every morning. Now step inside. The surprise for a modern person would not be what was there. It would be what was not there. No dense arrangement of furniture, no rows of cabinets, no thick separation between one domestic activity and another. In simpler houses, archaeology suggests interiors may have contained little more than a hearth and portable sleeping arrangements such as mats or raised wooden frames. In more substantial residences, excavations reveal benches, sometimes L-shaped, sometimes straight, likely used for sleeping or sitting. This means the house was not static through the day. The same space changed function with the hours. Morning, work. Midday, preparation. Evening, eating. Night, sleep. The room did not belong to one purpose. It belonged to the household rhythm. That rhythm gave even a small interior remarkable complexity. A bench was not just a bench. It could be a place to sleep, a place to sit, a place to store, a place of status, even a place near an altar. A mat was not just bedding. It could be seat, work surface, temporary bed, or a clean layer between body and floor. The house became efficient, not because it contained many objects, but because the few objects it contained could change roles. This is one of the deepest differences between an ancient Maya dwelling and a modern one. Modern houses specialize rooms. Maya households often specialized actions. A place became what the family was doing there at that moment. Storage worked the same way. It was dispersed, vertical, and often more ingenious than obvious. At the exceptionally preserved site of Cerdo, archaeologists found that only a minority of household artifacts had been left in floor contact. Many more were stored above floor level. Obsidian tools and bone needles were tucked into the thatch at accessible points, especially near corners and above doorways. That one detail opens an entire world. It tells us the roof was not dead space. It was part of the household system. It tells us domestic organization included memory as much as furniture. Every person needed to know where the cutting tools were kept, where the needles were hidden, where the serving vessels belonged, what could be reached quickly, and what should stay away from children. A Maya house was not empty. It was simply arranged according to another logic. And then there was the kitchen. In many reconstructions of the ancient world, cooking is imagined inside the same room where everyone slept. Sometimes that did happen. But Maya evidence also shows another arrangement. Separate kitchen structures, often placed slightly away from the residence, likely to reduce the risk of fire. At Cerdo, the kitchen was circular, lighter in construction than the domicile, and centered on a prominent three-stone hearth. At Caracol, archaeologists note that kitchens could sit in non-focal locations, and that some may have existed beneath simple thatched shelters that left little archaeological trace. This matters because it changes the sound and smell of domestic life. The household was not always one enclosed box. It could be a choreography of buildings, each with its own task, all bound together by the patio between them. Imagine that kitchen at dawn, not as a museum display, but as a place already warm before sunrise. A thin thatch roof above, clay or ash underfoot, a 3-stone hearth still holding some memory of the previous night's heat. Someone kneels or bends to coax the flame back. Someone else reaches for a pot. Maize, water, hands, stone, smoke. The daily labor that fed the Maya world was not performed in palaces first. It began here, in the household, in repetitive acts so ordinary that they disappear from history unless archaeology recovers them. That is one reason domestic evidence is so powerful. It returns civilization to the level where bodies lived it. No object captures that better than the metate. Again and again, archaeologists find manos and metats, the handstone and grinding stone associated with maize processing, near domestic structures. In Cerdo, one heavily used metat sat by the household hearth. In other houses, fragments of manos and metats lie beside benches, on floors, or just outside dwellings. These are not decorative finds. They are the marks of repetitive labor, of grain being transformed into food by force, skill, and time. If you want to hear the heartbeat of a Maya household, it is not the sound of royal ceremony first. It is the scraping rhythm of stone on stone as maize is ground for the day. And once you understand that, the house changes again. It becomes louder, more physical, more human. Not silent ruins, but domestic percussion. Grinding, sweeping, clay vessel against packed floor. Children crossing the patio, a lid being lifted, rain beginning on thatch, voices moving from doorway to yard. The house also becomes more fragile. Every meal meant ash. Every wet season meant repair. Every dry season meant dust. A beautiful stone temple can make a civilization look invincible. A household shows you its maintenance burden. It reveals how much of civilization depends not on glory, but on repetition. The vessels inside the household deepen that picture. At Cerdo, one excavated household held more than 70 ceramic vessels, with many used for preparing, storing, serving, and consuming food and drink. That number should destroy any simplistic image of a primitive hut containing almost nothing. Even a modest household could manage a complicated material world. Pots for water, pots for maize, vessels for cooking, vessels for serving, containers for storage, fine wares in some settings, plain wares in others. The Maya house was not materially barren. It was materially selective. What stayed in the household had to justify the labor of making it, carrying it, storing it, and protecting it. Now look outward again from the doorway. You are not just in a house. You are in a compound. Archaeologists working at sites such as Caracol have long noted that Maya residential groups often included multiple buildings arranged around a small plaza or patio, and that many such groups were occupied by extended family households. Some structures were residences, some were kitchens, some were ritual buildings, some may have served storage or other auxiliary functions. That means the Maya household was rarely just a nuclear family sealed inside one building. It was social architecture, kinship architecture, cooperation architecture. The domestic world extended across the yard, and the yard itself was an organizing force. That arrangement shaped human behavior in ways a floor plan alone cannot show. A child growing up here learned roots before rules were ever spoken. Which structure belonged to fire? Which one belonged to sleeping? Which side of the patio one crossed quietly? Where elders sat, where tools were stored, when the hearth was approached, where food was carried. Domestic space taught social order, not as abstract ideology, but as movement repeated until it felt natural. The house was not just where Maya life happened. It helped produce Maya life. It trained timing, respect, memory, and responsibility. And the house was not purely practical. This is one of the most important corrections archaeology makes. In the pre-classic Maya lowlands, round platforms built in residential areas appear to have hosted ritual performances, including dances, creating a space that was neither fully private nor fully public. Later, residential groups at Caracol often focused ritual attention on an Eastern structure within the household compound. In other words, Maya domestic life was not neatly divided between ordinary life in one place and sacred life somewhere else. The household could contain both. Cooking, sleeping, repair, offering, memory, and ceremony existed in relation to one another. The house was a lived cosmology, not merely a shelter from weather. This is why the patio matters so much. To us, it might seem like empty space between structures. To a Maya household, it could be the zone where domestic and ritual life touched. It gathered foot traffic, labor, conversation, and perhaps at times performance. It was cleared, maintained, and kept legible. In a world without modern storage rooms, hallways, and sealed interiors, clarity of outdoor domestic space was essential. The household was read in the patio. Who lived here? How many structures belonged together? Where status was expressed? Where routine gathered itself each day? The patio was the household's public face and private center at once. What about comfort? That depends on what we mean by the word. A Maya house could be beautiful without being luxurious in the modern sense. The comfort came from airflow, shade, practiced arrangement, and materials suited to climate. Light walls and thatch could breathe. A raised floor or platform lifted the living surface above the yard. A detached kitchen kept major fire risk at some distance. Hard-packed patios reduced clutter. Benches or mats made sleeping possible without bulky furniture. But none of that removed labor. Comfort was not achieved once and then forgotten. It had to be maintained. Rethatch the roof, patch the wall, renew the floor, keep the patio clean, protect vessels, monitor food, guard against weather. A Maya house was comfortable only as long as the household kept working. And here the differences between households become sharper. From the street, some Maya dwellings may have looked broadly similar. Thatch above, platform below, a cluster around a yard. But archaeology shows real variation in size, construction quality, and internal features. At Tikal, for example, some domestic buildings were of stone and plaster, though still usually roofed with thatch rather than stone vaulting. At Kauinal and related excavations, some residences had benches, formal hearths, adobe-faced elements, or more substantial walls, while more hypothetical peasant homes may have had little more than a burnt earth hearth, simple pole walls, mats, and a thatched roof. Status did not begin only at the temple staircase. It began at home. That difference was not only visual, it changed experience. A better-built platform stayed stable longer. Better walls held their shape better through weather. More substantial benches made interior life easier. More vessels meant more storage and more options. A separate storehouse protected surplus. A household with enough labor could keep its structures repaired before damage spread. A household without that margin lived closer to failure. One severe season, one leaking roof, one broken vessel too many, and the house became harder to manage. Archaeology rarely preserves those anxieties directly, but the logic of domestic construction makes them visible. A house was a buffer against uncertainty, and not every family possessed the same buffer. This is also why ordinary Maya houses matter more than they first seem to. When people imagine ancient civilizations, they often imagine power from the top down: rulers, monuments, wars, dynasties. But the household shows civilization from the ground up. It shows who processed the food, who maintained the yard, who repaired the wall, who stored the tools, who taught children the order of the compound, who carried daily life through the seasons. The Maya world was not sustained by temples alone. It was sustained by households that turned architecture into routine and routine into survival. Stand there a little longer, and another misconception falls away. Simplicity is not the same as emptiness. A Maya house could be materially modest and still socially dense, ritually meaningful, technically intelligent, and emotionally full. A few structures around a patio could contain grandparents, married children, labor obligations, stored grain, ritual memory, and the daily transformation of maize into food. That is not a thin life. It is a compressed one, dense with meaning. The ancient Maya did not need a large enclosed house to create a rich domestic world, because the household was distributed across platform, room, kitchen, patio, roof, and social memory. And perhaps that is the most important shift of all. Once you understand the Maya house, the Maya city itself begins to look different. The pyramid is no longer the only meaningful architecture. The palace is no longer the only place where order lived. Beneath the monumental skyline were thousands of domestic decisions. Where to place the kitchen, how to orient the compound, how to store tools, how to keep the patio clean, how to protect fire from rain and roof from fire, how to sleep in a room that by day served other purposes, how to embed ritual in the spaces of ordinary life. The civilization becomes less theatrical and more real, less distant and more inhabited. So what were houses like in the Maya civilization 2,000 years ago? They were lighter than the ruins suggest, but not less sophisticated. They were built from earth, timber, fiber, and thatch, but often set on prepared platforms and organized with great care. They were practical enough to answer climate, social enough to hold extended families, and meaningful enough to blur the line between domestic space and sacred space. They were places where smoke rose, maize was ground, tools were hidden in the roof, feet crossed hard-packed patios, and architecture taught people how to live together. And when we step inside those houses, we recover something the stone monuments alone cannot give us. We recover proportion. We recover scale. We recover the truth that every great civilization is carried first by ordinary rooms, ordinary labor, ordinary families, and ordinary days repeated over generations. The Maya did build soaring temples. But before the temple, there was the house. Before the ruler's monument, there was the kitchen fire. Before the city became famous, someone swept the patio, patched the wall, lifted a vessel from storage, and began again.